A stock 1975 Camaro idles at a stoplight. The cam is mild. The exhaust note is restrained. Throttle response feels polite. On paper, it makes 145 net horsepower. Now imagine that same car 6 months later. Long tube headers, a hotter camshaft, a Holley 4-barrel, and 3.73 gears in the rear. It doesn't just sound different. It feels like a completely different machine. And that right there is the real story of 1970s muscle cars, because the factory didn't finish those cars. You did, when the factory pulled back. By 1970, the horsepower war had peaked. Chevrolet had the LS6 454 rated at 450 gross horsepower. Ford had the 428 Cobra Jet. Chrysler had the 426 Hemi. Compression ratios were north of 10.5 to 1. Solid lifters clattered at idle. Engines were built to make power. Then, everything shifted. Insurance companies began penalizing high-performance models. The Clean Air Act tightened emission standards. Engines were detuned. Compression dropped into the 8.0 to 8.5 range. Cam timing was softened. Ignition timing was retarded. And in 1972, the industry switched from gross horsepower ratings to net horsepower ratings. Suddenly, cars looked weaker on paper. And often, they were. But here's the important part. Most of those engines were not fundamentally weak. They were restricted. Let me ask you something. Do you remember the first time you realized your car had more in it than the factory allowed? Because for a lot of guys, that realization happened quickly. The mods that actually worked. The 1970s didn't kill performance. They just moved it into garages. And some modifications made a real difference. Not magazine fantasy builds. Real street mods. Camshaft swaps. One of the first upgrades many guys made was the cam. Factory cams in the mid-70s were conservative, short duration, low lift, designed for emissions compliance and smooth idle. Swap in a more aggressive hydraulic cam from Crane, Isky or Comp cams, and the engine woke up. Longer duration allowed more air and fuel into the cylinders. Lift increased valve opening. Power shifted higher in the RPM range. Idle became rougher. Vacuum dropped. But the car felt alive. You could hear it, and you could feel it. Carburetor upgrades. Many mid-70s cars ran smaller carburetors tuned lean for emissions. Swapping to a properly sized Holley 750 CFM with mechanical secondaries changed throttle response immediately. But here's the truth. Oversized carbs often hurt performance if not tuned correctly. Jetting mattered. Float levels mattered. Vacuum leaks mattered. The guys who learned to tune properly saw gains. The guys who guessed, not always. Headers and dual exhaust. Factory exhaust manifolds were restrictive. Long tube headers improved exhaust scavenging. True dual exhaust reduced back pressure. The result? More power, better throttle response, and a deeper, harder exhaust note. Sometimes the biggest difference wasn't measured on a dyno. It was measured in how the car felt when you stepped into it. Rear gear swaps, the secret weapon. Now here's the modification that doesn't get enough credit. Rear axle ratios. By the mid-70s, many cars left the factory with 2.73 or 3.08 gears. Great for fuel economy, not great for acceleration. Swap in 3.55 or 3.73 gears, and the car transformed. Torque multiplication increased. Acceleration improved dramatically. The engine got into its power band faster. In many cases, a gear swap made a bigger difference than adding 40 horsepower. Let me ask you this. If you could only choose one mod back then, camshaft or rear gears, which would you pick? A lot of experienced guys will say gears, and they're not wrong. What didn't work? Now let's balance this. Not every street mod made cars faster. Simply removing smog equipment without proper tuning often hurt drivability. Throwing in too much cam killed low-end torque. Oversized carburetors bogged engines. Poor ignition timing left power on the table. Some builds ran worse after upgrades than they did stock. There was a learning curve, and that learning curve built skill. You learned to read spark plugs. You learned to adjust timing by ear. You learned what detonation sounded like. It wasn't plug and play. It was trial and error, and that's part of what made it meaningful. Why the 70s street scene mattered. The 1970s created something that doesn't always get enough credit. Factory performance may have slowed down, but backyard performance accelerated. As Detroit detuned engines for emissions and insurance pressures, enthusiasts stepped in. Speed shops flourished in small towns and big cities alike. Saturday nights weren't just for cruising. They were for wrenching. Hoods up. Tools scattered. Timing lights flashing against garage walls. Hot Rod magazine wasn't just entertainment, it was education. It taught you what worked, what didn't, and what to try next. There was real pride in making a mid-70s car quicker than anyone expected it to be. And something important shifted during that decade. Responsibility moved from the factory to the owner. Detroit wasn't delivering 11.25-to-1 compression anymore. If you wanted performance, you built it yourself. You chose the cam. You picked the gears. You tuned the carb. You adjusted the distributor by feel and sound. That hands-on ownership changed the relationship between man and machine. Do modern cars take some of that away? Today, software does the adjusting. Back then, your hands did. The gross versus net misunderstanding. There's another factor that often gets lost when people talk about 1970s performance. In 1972, the industry switched from gross horsepower ratings to net horsepower. Gross numbers were measured on an engine dyno, with no accessories, open exhaust, and ideal tuning. Net ratings reflected the engine as installed in the car, with full exhaust, air cleaner, water pump, alternator, and emissions equipment attached. That change alone made engines look dramatically weaker on paper. A 1971 engine rated at 350 gross horsepower might realistically translate to around 270 net. Meanwhile, a 1973 engine rated at 250 net horsepower wasn't necessarily worlds apart from what came before, at least not as much as the numbers suggested. The perception dropped faster than the performance, and that shift damaged the era's reputation. On the street, a well-tuned mid-70s car with headers, a cam swap, proper carburation, and steeper rear gears could run far stronger than its brochure implied. Not 1969 LS6 territory, but strong enough to command respect at a stoplight. The truth is this: the 1970s were not the end of muscle cars. They were the beginning of something different. They were the era when performance moved from factory engineering departments into home garages. When young men learned timing curves instead of relying on computers. When gear swaps felt like horsepower gains. When you could transform a car with basic tools and determination. The factory built the platform, but you unlocked it. And maybe that is why those cars still matter. Not because of what the brochure said, but because of what you made them become. So here is the question I will leave you with. What was the first modification that made your car feel truly alive? Next time, we're going to look at the rear axle that made those gear swaps possible, and why certain differentials earned reputations just as legendary as the engines bolted in front of them. Because horsepower may get the headlines, but the right combination of parts, chosen by hand, is what made the street cars of the 1970s faster than factory.